System recovery. In this nugget, we'll be taking a look at system recovery, which of course is a critical part of any administrator's daily job functions. You need to be making regular backups, and if something goes wrong, you need to know how to restore a system, such as from data backup or from volume shadow copy or from any of these other methods we'll be talking about. Now, the volume shadow copy service is pretty much a critical thread that runs through a lot of what we'll be talking about here. For example, it's included in Microsoft's Windows NT Backup now, and this will allow us to back up files even if they're locked open by an application. Also, we'll have the automated system recovery that you can use, and this will restore a system and all of its operating system files to kind of a pristine, known working state, so that if you have a total disaster on a machine, you lose a hard drive or whatever, you can recover it back to its previous condition. They'll also take a look at the shadow copy restore feature, which I think is possibly Microsoft's best idea and best functional working idea for getting data back from a network drive. Now, it's not Microsoft's idea alone. There's been a lot of other companies that have had this for years, but at least in terms of what it's included in the box with Microsoft's operating system, this really works very, very well. I don't know if you've seen my video bio up on the internet. It's up on cbtnuggets.com. And on this video bio, if you have seen it, you've seen me drinking out of this ginormous cup of coffee. It's just probably like the world's largest coffee cup. Anyway, my wife bought me like 6 or 8 of these coffee cups. And one day I'd filled one up with a fresh cup of hot steaming coffee. I raise it up to my mouth. I'm in the kitchen. I raise it up to my mouth to take the first sip of my morning coffee, and the handle that I'm holding it onto with just falls right off and separates from the cup. The whole cup comes crashing down on the floor. There's hot coffee everywhere. My wife found it quite entertaining. I didn't think it was that funny. I don't know where she gets her sense of humor. Anyway, fortunately, she bought so many of them that I had a backup. You see, it never hurts to have a backup, and that's never more true than it is with Windows Server 2003 and the Volume Shadow Copy service. Now, the Volume Shadow Copy service is used for a couple of different purposes, really. One of those is data transport, and the other main one, really, is for shadow copy and restore and then backup. Now, with I guess that's actually 3 things, isn't it? Not a couple of things, but a few things. The data transport issue is not something we'll directly address here, but just the capability exists within Volume Shadow Copy service so that vendors can use this and database applications can use this. And what they can do is they can do something like offload for data mining. For example, maybe here's where my main data is stored in some kind of a database. And what we do is we have customer service representatives frequently updating information on here. And because they want to have a high level of customer service, they want this to perform very well so that they don't have people on the phone just waiting and waiting, and so they don't have to constantly make that apology that I often get from my bank. I'm sorry, the computers are really slow today. So anyway, what they can do is if they want to do any data mining, maybe they just want to do a marketing blitz, and they want to scan for everybody that's in the desert Southwest. So they're looking for Southern California, New Mexico, and Arizona. Well, they can use the Volume Shadow Copy service to kind of offload part of that data. I don't know why I put a square there, but upload part of that data in whatever this body of data is right here, this desert Southwest. And then what happens is whoever's performing all this data mining is going to do so against this copy of the data, and then the customer service representatives can continue to update our customer information on this live data over here. And that way, when my data mining people over here are data mining against the Southwest, they're not slowing down the main database here, and we get to get a performance increase from it. We can also use it for shadow copy restore. And I'm going to show you that later on in this series, later on in this same nugget. I got to say that's possibly my favorite feature of the new Windows Server 2003's capabilities. This will really help you out a lot. Could potentially also save your company some money. So look out for that one. What this is going to do is it's going to give us the ability for users to basically perform their own restore of data without having to get it off of expensive and slow tape. We can also just use Volume Shadow Copy service for backup, and that's going to be used by default anytime you use NT Backup. And for most other third-party vendors as well, for their backup software, it also can take advantage of the Volume Shadow Copy service. Now let's take a look at how the Volume Shadow Copy service works with the NT Backup utility. Now there are other vendors that can also work with Volume Shadow Copy service, but of course we'll address what's out of the box. Now, a big problem with backup in the past has been that if an application has a file locked open, there's no way for the backup utility to back up that data. And there may be some applications that constantly have the same files open, so those files may never get backed up, or there may be an application that has a critical file open that you really needed a backup at that point in time, and it just wasn't available. So what we can do with Volume Shadow Copy is it can tell that application to freeze. And when it freezes that application, then it will take that data that somebody's been working on right here, and then it will send that into, or rather make available, that is, what we call a buffer space, and this buffer space will be available for the users to make read-write changes to with their application. And in the meantime, when that's gone on, there's going to be a shadow copy that takes place of this live data, and it just quickly sends it out to a copy. So it copies that out in a shadow copy of the data. Now, during this brief moment when the buffer space is reserved and there's a copy made in the shadow copy space, what happens if a user needs to make a write to that data right at the very moment when this shadow copy is being created? Well, that's what the buffer space is for, because that's where the change will be made, will be in this buffer. And then once the shadow copy has been made, then we go into a thaw process, and then whatever was in the buffer gets flushed back into the live file. Then what we do is we have a backup using, in this case, NT backup, and it just backs up our volume shadow copy of that data. And once the backup is made and we don't need the shadow copy version anymore, that will be then deleted. Now let's take a look at how volume shadow copy might work with the NT backup utility. See, here I've got a file open, and it's something that I might make changes in every hour, so I pretty much just keep it open on my desktop every hour of the day. Well, if this is on a home directory or something like that, an administrator wants to make a backup of that home directory, chances are this is not going to get backed up under conventional methods because it's locked open by the application. So what we can do now is to go to All Programs, Accessories, System Tools, and choose Backup. And now choosing Backup, we'll use the Volume Shadow Copy service to allow us to still make a backup of this file even though it's left open. Now I'm going to go to Advanced Mode. You can also use a wizard, which is next finishes you through either backing up or restoring. I'm going to go to the Advanced method here so that we can be more particular about what we're going to back up, which in this case is going to be this one file within my documents. And then I'll just back it up to the D drive, and I'll just call this, mybackup.bkf. Then once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and click on Start Backup, where I'm met with the opportunity to create a description for it as well as a media label for this. And this might be especially useful if I'm working with tape. Right now I don't have a tape drive available. If I did, there would be one available in this drop-down list. So I'm just going to work with a file. I can also append this backup to the media, and that would just add it to whatever's already there, especially, for example, on a tape. Or I could replace the data on the media with this backup. Now, once I've chosen this option, I also have the option to allow only the owner and administrator access to that backup data. I could also choose to schedule it, which would happen on a periodic basis as scheduled, and it would work with the scheduler service within scheduled tasks. Then I could also choose advanced options here. I could back up data that's in remote storage, and this is older data that's been normally stored on hard drive, and it's been archived off to removable media or cheaper and less expensive media, such as a tape library. And the system will still see it as if it were stored on a local hard drive or on a hard drive somewhere, but in reality it's on that remote storage. So I could back that up as well if I want to check that box. Verify the data after backup to pretty much explains itself. I can also compress the backup data to save space. Now, why isn't that available? Because I don't have a tape backup available and a tape drive available. And if I did have a tape drive available and it supports compression, then I can check that box. And this next option here that's also grayed out would be available if I were creating a system state backup. A system state backup would include, for example, all of my boot files. If I check this box along with it, then it would also back up everything within the system root. Then I can also disable the volume shadow copy. Can't really think of a good reason to do that, but I could do so. And then you have various options here for the various types of backups you want to create. I'll describe these later on. For now, we'll go ahead and just use a normal, kind of vanilla, normal backup here. We'll go ahead and click OK here. And we'll just start the backup. It's going to happen pretty quick. You see it's using shadow copy right now. That's where it's going to go ahead and freeze the application, create a little buffer space for anything that wants to write to the data, and then it's going to go ahead and back up the copied version of the shadow copy data. And then that only took a few seconds, and then now we see that it is completed. I can click on Report and see that it indeed did create a backup of a single file, and that's exactly what I expected. That's exactly what I wanted. So now once that's been done, I could also go to that backup, and I could restore and manage my media. I could go to my backup here, where I see under Documents, Settings, Trainer, My Documents right here, I've got that activity log file, and I could restore that if necessary. And that's pretty easy. You just click on Restore. Okay, so that's pretty much it. That's how we can use the Volume Shadow Copy service within a backup. Now, I told you I'd describe the various types of backups that you can use, and here they are listed down here. We'll go through these one at a time so we can see the differences between them. Now, the critical thing to keep in mind here is something called the archive bit. And that's the technical name of it, just the archive bit. But if we take a look at the actual name of it within the file system here, and by right-clicking on this file that I had open earlier and choosing Properties, we see that if I go to the Advanced button down here, that there's an item there that says file is ready for archiving. You see, anytime I use a backup utility, and this is true of just about any backup utility, not just Microsoft's, then what it does is it takes that file and it will clear this archive bit. And since I just made a backup of this file, it's cleared that archive bit. Now, if I were to go back into the file and make a change to this file again, and let me just go to 6 o'clock here, then I could make a change and save that file. Now when I go back into this, we see that since it's had a change made to it, it now again has this checkbox automatically made to it again. Now that checkbox relating to whether or not it's been archived is critical in understanding how these various backup types work. You see, what happens is the first backup you'll normally make is just called a normal backup. And what that will do is it'll create a backup of any file that you've created, whether or not it has the archive bit selected there. But if it did have an archive bit selected, then it will go ahead and clear that archive bit. So there's no checkbox in that little property that we just looked at. Any files that I started to back up at the beginning of this, if they were already cleared, it'll still back them up. The issue is whether or not it clears those archive bits, and that's the issue through all of these various types. Well, again, with the normal type, it will clear all archive bits once it's finished there. Now, the incremental backup will look at the archive bits, and this is only going to back up any files that have a checkbox in that archive bit. And that's going to represent, then, any new or changed data since Monday. Well, that means that my incremental backup sets are going to be quite a lot smaller in terms of the size in megabytes or terabytes or however big they are than whatever I had on my Monday's backup. Now, once it's backed up that data on Tuesday, for example, it backs it all up, then it will clear the archive bit. This means that for each subsequent backup that we have, it's only going to create a backup of any new or changed data since the previous day. So on Friday, it's only going to back up new or changed data since Thursday, not new or changed data since Monday. Now, this is good and it's bad. The good news is I got a lot less storage media to use because it requires not quite as much storage as the next version we'll look at, which will be differential. The bad news is if I have a file that I need from this Friday backup right here, then I don't just need this Friday backup tape, and let's just assume that each one of these is on a separate, different tape. Then I don't need just this Friday tape. I need the Friday tape plus the Thursday tape plus the Wednesday tape plus the Tuesday tape plus the Monday tape to totally reconstruct that backup. And in a single tape drive, man, this can take hours and hours and hours to read all of that data from each one of the tapes. I mean, it can be extremely cumbersome. And in corporations, you're going to have some kind of a tape robotic library to be able to do this for you. It's still going to take a long time, relatively speaking, but it's going to be a lot faster than working with something like a single tape drive. Now, the difference here with the differential backup is on each subsequent day for each one of my differential backups, it does not clear my archive bit. It has it checked when it backs it up, and it leaves it checked when it's done backing up. That means then that when Wednesday comes along, it's still going to look for the archive bit. Well, that's going to include more data because that's going to be new or changed data on Tuesday and new or changed data on Wednesday as well. And the net effect of what's going to happen with this, since it leaves everything checked, is it's going to be any new or changed data since my last normal backup. Thursday, the same thing happens. It looks for the archive bit, but it doesn't clear it when it's done. So again, it's going to be all the new or changed data since Monday's backup here. And then the same thing would, again, of course, happen on a Friday as well. It doesn't clear any of the archive bits. Now, here's the disadvantage of this. The backup takes longer, whereas this actually would take shorter as well on each subsequent day. So the backup takes longer, and it requires substantially more space in many situations. So you might need to prepare for an investment in more tape or backup media. The good news is if I have a single file here from Friday's backup that I need to restore, all I need is the backup tape from Friday and the backup tape from Monday, and it's going to be much faster to reconstruct than having to swap all of these tapes out throughout the whole days of the week. Now then I can also create a copy of the data. Now a copy does not care what the archive bit is. It doesn't look for archive bits, and when it's done backing up, it doesn't clear the archive bits. So it just leaves the archive bits alone the way they were in the first place. The advantage of using a copy for the backup is I might want to create a backup of my data as the way it appeared at a certain point in time, maybe right here between Tuesday and Wednesday somewhere. And the advantage of doing it this way then is since it doesn't fiddle around with the archive bits at all, it does not throw off my incremental backup for Wednesday. Then I can also create a daily backup, which again does not do anything with the archive bits, but it is only going to back up the data that was created or modified on the day that you create that backup. Now, you also want to be very careful that you secure the backups that you create. One of the ways that you're going to be able to do that is very closely monitor who your backup operators are. Look at the event logs, see when they're making backups. Are they making backups outside of their normal scheduled hours when they're supposed to be making the backups? Are they coming in at 12 o'clock midnight and making a backup surreptitiously? Maybe they're putting it on a CD-ROM and taking it to your competitors. So be very careful to monitor and be careful to look at who your backup operators are, because even though they might not be full domain admins or enterprise admins, in terms of data compromise, they can be equally as threatening as any administrator. You also should use that little checkbox I showed you earlier within the NT Backup utility, stating that only the owner or the administrator can restore the data. That way, if you have some tapes, let's say in a cabinet somewhere, even if it's a locked cabinet, if someone, after hours kind of pries that open and just takes the tape, well, without this checkbox selected, they could be just Joe User with 0 administrator privileges and still take that tape and retrieve data off of it. So try to put a roadblock up there and allow only the owner or the administrator to bring it back. Then also, as far as the run as command is concerned, as is always the case, you only want to log on as a generic Joe user and then use your administrator privileges to use the run as function to run the tape backup utility or whatever backup utility you're using as your administrator account. And then also, again, make sure that you have good physical security. Even that cabinet that I talked about earlier where someone could pry it open. Well, yeah, you got a lock on it, so that's good, but something that's that sensitive should also be vaulted, not just behind a locked file cabinet with cheap metal on it or something like that anybody with a crowbar could get into. So keep it locked in your server room somewhere. Keep it under surveillance of some kind. Maybe you have a room with key card access. Make sure that you've got highest level of physical security that you can possibly provide for that. And in fact, many companies that are also somewhat larger companies will also have some sort of offsite storage where they can store their data, not only for disaster recovery in terms of something like a natural disaster, but also to add an additional layer of security so it makes that data less accessible. Now let's go ahead and address automated system recovery here, which is not to be confused, by the way, with Windows XP's System Restore. Let me just get a brief note on that. Windows XP's System Restore is actually a pretty cool feature. What it does is it creates point-in-time backups of critical system information, and it can do this automatically or manually. It does it automatically, for example, anytime I add new drivers to the system. Well, it just assumes that, oh, hey, this guy might be adding some bad drivers that are going to blue screen us or something like that. So it'll automatically create a system restore of that XP computer. And you can also do it manually if you say, you know what, I'm about to make a whole bunch of system changes here, and I'm going to manually create a system restore just in case I goof everything up. Frankly, I wish they also offered that for Windows Server 2003 because it's a terrific way of restoring a system. I think the only reason why they don't do it is because they don't want to have unexpectedly system resources consumed by using that system restore. By the way, that does also take place automatically on a daily basis, whether or not you're making changes. Now, as far as Windows Server 2003's automated system recovery is concerned, and I wish they wouldn't name these things so close together because I got to really think about when I say them. Windows Server 2003 has automated system recovery. What we can do with this is create a backup of the system and boot partition. By the way, why do they call this automated? I have no idea because everything I'm going to show you how to do is a totally manual procedure, so I don't know why they call it that. Anyway, it's a backup of the system and boot partition. Notice that this will not create a backup of any data. So if I have, some data files that are user files, something like that, on the system or boot partitions, then it's not going to back up that user data. It's only going to back up stuff relating to the operating system itself. And the whole point of this is so that if the operating system totally, goes south, then I can use an ASR backup to totally recover the operating system health of that machine, not the data though. Now, no sooner do I say all of that than I also have to point out that, yes, you can get all of the user data along with an ASR. And I'll show you the difference between just an ASR and the ASR and all of the data. A little bit later on, we'll actually show you the backup utility with ASR. Now, let me also point out that when you create an ASR backup using one of the two methods that I'll show you, it'll also create a backup of all the volume information. And this is just going to be stuff such as the disk signatures, the size of the disk, the size of the partition, all that kind of thing. And then when you need to recover from a disaster, you can boot from the Windows Server 2003 CD-ROM, and you'll see an F2 message early in that boot process where it'll say press F2 to recover an ASR backup, or words to that effect. Anyway, when you do that, then it will prompt you also for that floppy disk where it's going to store the information about the volumes. In order to make this successfully work, however, the disks that I'm replacing, if maybe I had a bad disk that went bad and I got to replace it with a new one, the disk that I replace it with has to be the same size or larger than the original disks that were included in the ASR backup. And you're also going to want to be careful of that, because what it will do is it will also format and just totally wipe out the drives that are included within this ASR backup. So make sure that you also have a data backup, either through one of the methods that I'll show you here or through a normal backup routine. Now here I'm running NT Backup again just by having clicked it on the Start menu. And if we use this wizard that initially appears to us when we always start in the wizard mode, and you can clear this if you want to and always go to advanced mode if you want. Anyway, if you use this wizard here and click on Next, notice that it asks what you want to do. Well, backup files and settings. Makes sense. That's what we want to do. Click on Next. Then this is where we get ASR involved, because this will say all information on this computer. Now that will include all data, including all user data on this computer, and your system signatures, your system drive, your boot drive, and all that kind of stuff. By the way, I did mention earlier that the system restore, the automated system restore, will back up your system and boot drives. Well, what is your system drive and what is your boot drive? This will really confuse you. The system drive has the boot files on it. The boot drive has the system files on it. So the boot drive has Windows, and the System32 directory and all that kind of stuff on it. Whereas the system drive has your boot INI file on it. Are you confused yet? Well, I know I am. I don't know why Microsoft had to name them that way, but that's what they did. Well, however you want to look at it, that's what it's going to back up, is the system and boot drive and all of the data. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just cancel out of this, or actually go back and go into the advanced mode here. Now, if I click on advanced mode, notice that I also have here Automated System Recovery Wizard. And if I click on that, again, it starts a wizard. It looks kind of like the same thing I just looked at, except now I can just specify where I want the backup to go. And then I could, again, just next, finish through this whole thing. And again, it's going to create a floppy at the end of this. Now, what's the difference between this and that first wizard that I just looked at when we initially launched the backup utility here? Well, that initial one will back up, like I said, the user data. This one, this backup here, the Automated System Recovery Preparation Wizard, is only going to back up the system and boot volumes and put all the floppy on a floppy disk, all the information about my volumes that are local here. Now, when it comes to restoring from an automated system recovery, what you have to do is to have the ASR backup available when you boot from the Windows Server 2003 CD-ROM, and make sure that the floppy is also in the drive. Or again, like I said earlier, during that process, there will be an F2 message, and what's going to happen when you choose to use an ASR recovery is that it's going to reconfigure the drives. That also is a euphemism here for format C:. That's going to format your drives, whatever was there originally when you created the ASR backup, because it's going to use the information on that floppy to reconstruct those actual drives. And then what it's going to do is it's going to copy the files from that Windows Server 2003 CD-ROM. So you're going to get kind of a bare installation of Windows Server 2003, just a modicum of Windows Server 2003, just enough so that it can load files, for example, from the tape now. Then when it takes the files from the tape, it will apply those files and overwrite any older system files that are maybe outdated from the CD-ROM with the newer files from your original ASR backup. And then by the time you're done, although you're going to be missing data with one of those ASR methods that I showed you earlier, although you're going to be missing some of the data potentially, the actual operating system itself and the way it runs should run exactly the way it ran before. So again, that's another reason why this is good with a cluster, because this is a way that I can totally recover that cluster, or at least that node that may have failed, because I bring back the entire configuration of that individual machine. Now let's go ahead and address possibly my favorite feature in all of Windows Server 2003, and that is Shadow Copy Restore. You see, I don't want to work with tape if I don't have to because it's slow, it's cumbersome, they're noisy, they're expensive, and I really don't like them, so I only use tape backups for my just normal archiving. Now, first of all, it's probably a good time to point out that you're still going to need to use tapes or whatever else your backup solution is. Shadow Copy Restore is not a substitute for an actual regular archival type of a backup. But it does help us in many respects. And first of all, let's take a look at some statistics from Microsoft about their own users and their own processes for restoring data conventionally from tape, regardless of the Shadow Copy Restore issue. First of all, Microsoft approximates that about 34% of file problems are because of user error. I don't know. That seems like a really low statistic. I know in my own organization, most of the file problems are because of user error. It's a lot more than 34%. But you got to understand that Microsoft's users are probably have a higher quotient of technically adept people there. So maybe that's why that's kind of low. And then if someone does goof up a file or accidentally delete it or something like that and they need it back from tape, well, they have to go through 3 escalations. You know, maybe it's something like, I got to call the help desk, and then the help desk has to call his or her supervisor, and then the supervisor has to call a backup operator, and the backup operator has to restore it. Well, by the time you get through the whole cycle of everybody you got to talk to and finding the right tape, finding the right date of the tape, finding the right state of the data, and restoring it from tape, that can take between 24 and 72 hours. Now, this is no fault of Microsoft. I don't want to pretend that Microsoft has a bad IT organization. They have possibly the top IT organization I've ever seen. The problem is, this is just the way tape restore is. It's cumbersome and it's a pain. So anyway, that's the way it is. And now, the other thing to consider there is, it costs, according to Microsoft's accounting anyway, about $300 to restore a single file for one user. And I'm sure that takes into account the hardware assets they have to use as well as the time of everyone involved. And I'll tell you what, though, I'll bet if you would charge the user $300 every time they lost a file, you'd get a lot fewer lost or deleted files. Well, let's take a look at how Volume Shadow Copy works. And I got to tell you, I have used this a number of different times. The videos that I'm recording, sometimes I'll just make a dumb mistake and I'll accidentally delete a file or override a file I didn't mean to override and that kind of thing. And I've actually saved a lot of time in real life by using this Volume Shadow Copy service. So I think you're going to really like it as well. And the overhead for it is not that great. You are going to have some high I/O for bursty periods when it creates its backup. But it's usually pretty tolerable, and Microsoft has a database that's about 1 terabyte in size. They say that it takes only about 30 to 45 seconds to create the Volume Shadow Copy backup of it. So it's not too bad, especially when you're working with that large of a data. Also, it may have some relationship to whether or not the data is on a SAN and where the backup is going to and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, we see here that I've got, I don't know why I right-clicked there, but we see here that I've got a public folder here, and we had a couple of files we created from an earlier point in time here, and maybe I've got another document here that I want to go ahead and create as well, you know, some WordPad document or something like that. And I'll just rename it to something that sounds like it's actually a work project. And maybe also go to my documents here where I've got a file here that I've been working earlier with. So I'll go ahead and paste that in here. So now I've got some data in a share. Now the reason why I'm putting it in this share is to point out something that's important about shadow copies. You see, shadow copy really only works with anything that is in a shared folder. It is not an automatic backup of every single folder that I've got on this entire local volume. It only really backs up, if you will, anything that's in a share. Now let's go ahead and configure Shadow Copy. What I could do is I could right-click my computer and I could choose Manage, and then I could go down to Disk Management and right-click on whichever volume I wanted to enable Shadow Copy capability for, and I could just right-click on it and choose Properties. Likewise, I could also just go right to that drive, choose Properties, and I have a Shadow Copies tab here that I can work with. Now it doesn't matter which of the drives I right-click on because it'll show all of the local volumes here. Now notice that I said local volumes. It has to be able to see this as a local volume in order to use shadow copies. I also have a network drive at drive Z, which of course does not appear here, and that's because Microsoft doesn't want you to creating a volume shadow copy of 500 megabytes across the wire and slow down your network traffic and hamper it. So this all has to be local. Now, I might be looking at this and say, hey, I'm ready to go right now. I'll click Enable. Well, don't get too happy there quite yet. We don't want to do that quite yet because we want to configure this for another purpose. You see, the C drive, if I just click Enable right now, it's going to back up data on C, and it will also back that data up on the same location. So the data is on C and the backup is on C for the volume shadow copy. I don't necessarily want that because that's going to keep that drive as a single point of failure, and it's going to also potentially make that drive a little too busy, especially during peak times of the day. So what I'll do instead is to go to settings here, and then I can choose a different drive, and I'll put it on drive D. And then the details button over here just tells you information about the drive space available on that disk. Now I could choose for the maximum size, no limit, and what that would do is it would create up to 64 copies of the data on that volume. Now when I hit my 65th copy, it'll overwrite the first copy in a FIFO basis, first in, first out. I can also choose to use a limit in terms of megabytes here, so this is about 2.5 gigabytes worth of data. Now, if the volume shadow copies that I create go up to 64 and it still doesn't use all of this space, then again, just like with the no limit, it'll overwrite on the 65th copy. But in this case, it's probably more likely to store fewer copies in that amount of space. And also notice here that you need at least 100 megabytes of free space to create any kind of a shadow copy. Also, we won't go into all the technical details of this right now, but it has kind of an intelligent way of saving space here. And what it really does is kind of like creating a normal backup and then creating incremental backups along the way, so it doesn't create a backup of all of the files all of the time every time it creates a shadow copy, just really of the changed bits of data. Now the next thing I want to do is to specify how often these backups take place, these shadow copy backups take place. And we see that by default it's at 7 a.m. and 12 noon every day on weekdays only. And you can adjust this according to whatever you need. Then I can also go to advanced here. This would allow me to terminate this after a certain period of time. So after a certain date, we'll no longer create shadow copies for specialized purposes. And you see you can repeat the task here however often you want as well. I'm okay with what we've got for the time being here on the defaults. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. And then we see that we now have the ability to run this on this volume. I'll go ahead and click Enable. It says, are you going to enable shadow copies? You're going to get high I/O if you do that. And that's the reason why we want to place it on a different volume than the storage of the volume that's actually being shadow copied. So I'll go ahead and click on Yes. And now at this point, we have volume shadow copy in operation. The first thing it does is at the moment in time that I create this, it'll actually create its first shadow copy. And after that, it'll do all the scheduling. So let's go ahead and take a look at how the volume shadow copy service might actually work for you or for a user, for anybody really. I just double click on my file here and I open it up and I see this file that I'd been working with earlier, and I'm teaching along here. I'm making, check boxes, and I got to get back to my fancy little blue little color here. So I'm making check boxes, I'm circling stuff, I'm making this all really ugly and all that kind of stuff. And then I just go ahead and close it, and then just reflexively I hit yes. Oh, for crying out loud, I just saved all that scribble and stuff on a good drawing, and I wanted to use that later on too. I mean, that drawing took me hours to create, right? So what I can do here now is, ask for it from a tape backup, which could take days, or I can actually go to the file and restore it as a user. And this is real easy to do in terms of user training as well. Now, first of all, I'm going to show you the wrong way to do this. Notice that I'm on the local drive here, and I'm going to right-click on the file that I messed up, choose Properties, and there's no tab here for previous versions. What I want to see is a tab that says Previous Versions that allows me to go back in time. So what I'll be able to do here is to go up here and to UNC to it instead, and I'll go DC Nugget 1, Public. And once I go to that Share Over the Network, then I can go right-click here, choose Properties. Now I have a Previous Versions tab, and I can recover this file from the previous version. I can just click on View if I want to double-check to make sure that it is the correct file, and it looks like it is the right one that I want. And then I can also then go to just Restore it. Now once I've restored it, it asks me if I want to do that, and I say yes. And it was successful. Now once I've done that, now I can go back to that file, and then I will be able to successfully double-click and open the previous version. And here it double-clicks and opens up just fine. That's exactly what I wanted, so we're in good shape. Now, let me point out that the Previous Versions client, which gives you that Previous Versions tab, is natively included in Windows Server 2003, but not natively included in any other operating system prior to Windows Server 2003. So for Windows 2000 or for Windows XP, what I'm going to need to do is to deploy a client piece for that. And let me show you where that's located. It's located under Windows, System 32, and then it's under Clients. I can get here, Clients. And then we have another item here, which is TW Client. And then we notice we have a version for AMD 64, Intel's 64 Titanium, and finally the more commonly used x86 version. This is the Previous Versions client, and since it's an MSI file, you can just deploy that using group policy or something like that. And then once it's deployed, my Windows 2000 and XP clients will then have that Previous Versions tab when they access this file over the network, or whatever file they need to restore from. In this nugget, we took a look at system recovery, and we saw that a critical part of that is the volume shadow copy service, which is kind of a continuing thread through a lot of these different topics. And not only does it allow us to manipulate data more effectively, but it also works very well with NT backup so that we can back up files even if they're locked open by an application. We also saw that automated system recovery is a great way to back up the boot and the system volumes of a computer. And that way, as a last resort, if it's totally gone bad, we can recover it totally, including all of the operating system files. And we also saw that the shadow copy restore is an excellent way to recover files for users. This will prevent us from having to go to expensive and slow tape, which is also more labor intensive. And in fact, you can even train your users to be able to recover their own files. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.